us started, and then we can dig in a little bit.
So I want to begin by saying the text and the entire book is like very abstract, and a lot of the terms, every time we read it, it's just hard to understand. But as a way to bring out the discussion and the intuitive appeal of McIntyre's work, not just the entire book, I want to focus on the chapters that we're due for today, chapter 2 and chapter 3. But at the same time, I want to connect the historical background with a contrast between McIntyre's position, which we'll get into, and this tradition that this picture of politics and individualism, Chogola invoked. I want to connect those things in a historical way, the contrast. So I shall pursue this talk by just first identifying where is this intuition that McIntyre is coming out. This is perhaps one of the most important works of political philosophy or moral philosophy in the 20th century. And McIntyre is, put all his energy and momentum to write this deadly book to somewhat offer a plausible criticism of the Kantian position we'll get into. So as a way of make this talk more intuitive, offer a historical background, and then secondly, I will emphasize what are the particular claims, since the goal of this talk is depth, not breadth, just particular ideas. And lastly, I want to bring this for discussion. So I want to pose some examples about our life history or events, thought experiments, which is what philosophers use. It's very strange, I think. They bring out some intuitive force. Peter Singer brings a thought experiment all the time. One of them says we're all evil because, yeah, I hate that guy. But he says basically if you don't donate money every day, we're evil. But either way, thought experiments are helpful to see in those events what would we have done. So after those things, as a way to further strengthen McIntyre's position, which I do believe is really strong, I want to offer some criticism of his position and also reply to those criticisms, but only 2 points. So first, this book, is reacting to a whole tradition of empirical philosophy where the Kantian and Lockean and Hobbesian view has been that the person who's deserving of rights and toleration, this philosophy of liberalism, was couched in that it's not necessarily the good person or the rational person who's deserving of rights. Locke would say it's the empirically existent person, whatever he or she or they happen to be. Because Locke would say that in essence, empiricism, a scientific project, coexisted with the way liberalism was brought out. It's uncontroversial to say that liberalism coexisted with the empiricism and the science, and very much is a scientific philosophy, as John Stuart Mill himself would say that because people are fallible, because this is him on liberty. John Stuart Mill says because people are fallible, and we might be fallible, hence we must be tolerant. So we respect other people, not as anything particular in them, but because they all have rights. But once we go later, this liberalism has taken a very strange sense, and that's what McIntyre is reacting to. This idea that we are independent authors of the purposes we choose to pursue. This picture that you also find in Rawls. John Rawls was a political philosopher, perhaps the most important political philosopher of the 20th century. And this whole tradition is what McIntyre wants to offer criticism, but although he wouldn't use explicit these words, and he uses examples. So when you look at this worksheet, the first, some of the things I mentioned, I think it's quite interesting and illuminating. If you think about what is this inherent conception of freedom that the Kantian position or John Locke or this whole essence of liberalism has to have an account of human nature. It presumes that we're self-sufficient and the only forces of our obligations are the ones that we have chosen for ourselves. So it's I might be my father's son, we all have parents, but I can't be responsible for what he does. I may belong to the country of Iran, but the liberalist position would say, I can't be responsible for my country unless I choose to pursue that responsibility. And that's the historical background. In essence, liberalism says that we are the independent authors of the only obligations that constrain us. We are the ones, this is couched in the social contract theory that we agree to be governed, right? This is what political philosophers call the voluntarist position. That people have rights insofar as be part of the political community, but the communitarian critics of Kantian and Rawlsian liberalism, which include McIntyre, don't like that because, while they agree it's valuable, they think it misses something. It misses a whole aspect of our life that can't be traced to what I just said, an act of consent. Obligations of solidarity that all of us here would praise. But yet, McIntyre wants to say that I can only pursue the good or exercise the virtues in relation to other people. Like, I can't do those things in isolation. And hence, I think we can put on two domains, the Kantian, the liberalist position, and the Aristotelian McIntyre position. Now, this might be like a somewhat strange distinction, but in chapter 2 and chapter 3, I will get later, but for now, for the sake of understanding where McIntyre comes from, the entire book, After Virtue, is an attack on this picture of human beings that we almost have taken for granted, that we are by ourselves, even by our memories, we are independent, we're authors of our lives. And I guess like McIntyre wants to say that in some sense that just realistically is impossible, because we have memories, we have stories, we had childhood, and what McIntyre wants to say that we can't pursue the good in isolation. I belong to this city, that tribe, that community. What is good for me has to be the good who inhabits these historical memories. To give you an example, if a young German, having born into in Germany, like was born after 1939, and he comes up and says, like, me having born in Germany after 1931, my existence, my life, my identity has no bearing to my Jewish contemporaries after what the Nazis did to Jews. Or like an American who says, after the history of slavery, given all the things that was done in 1865 in the war, like my relationship has no bearing to my contemporaries. McIntyre wants to say that amounts to a sort of historical amnesia that is almost like, he also said the word moral abdication. It's like refusing to acknowledge that your identities are related to, our identities are really related to each other. And that's very much, I guess, in contrast with the liberalist position, because from the liberalist position, our obligations are insofar as we agree to them. This is what we call voluntarism, we couch it. But, so, in some sense, I guess, like, the distinction I feel like is most compelling for McIntyre is between goods and rights. Earlier we read Aristotle, who, like, I guess he didn't like democracy and what's happening now. But the reason was that for Aristotle, to investigate the ideal constitution, we must first figure out the best way to live. Hence, for Aristotle, our political existence is related to the question of the good life. And that's, I think, how I'm going to get into chapter 2 and chapter 3. Because leaving aside moral judgments, I guess this intuition that we all have that we almost have this obsession, I guess, like in modern life. This is my concept that I am entitled to almost like every rights conceivable. Whereas, like I'm saying, like McIntyre and Aristotle would say, let's bring back this teleological way of thinking that there's like a telos in politics, which the liberalists don't believe. The liberal tradition, they almost couch in like the state ought not have the right to determine truth, historical truth, and punish people who deviate from it. Like the whole essence of this tradition that McIntyre is arguing is that the state ought not define what a good life is. Everyone have, in essence, it should be independent of the private sphere. Like happiness, virtue, flourishing shouldn't be part of the conceptual apparatus, and they do argue that part of what a government is supposed to do. And it's this epistemology, political epistemology, that McIntyre wants to call into question. But insofar as that's just, I guess, like to see where he's coming from, that's how I'm doing on time. And I guess, like, in some sense, what I want to say is, in relation to chapter 2 and chapter 3, I guess when we're judging things, having a substantive discourse about applied ethics, such as abortion or wealth distribution, or how, like, affirmative action, any other tax, Americans hate taxes, but in essence, we have to, like, we presume that we're talking about, like, actual ethical concerns. and we run over each other. This talk we had about language and discursive practice, we almost like presume that what we're really talking about are moral claims, or here's might be a little technical, I guess, in the way that McIntyre put, but our disagreements aren't really about moral conceptions, but they're couched in, but in fundamental, we disagree about the principles we would invoke, because to have a substantive discourse about ethics, we need, I guess, some non-reductivist account. McIntyre would say, like those elementary principles that we would agree with. Okay, like there has to be civil discourse. Goodness is in the external world, not in our minds. And I guess McIntyre wants to say, like, we presume our disagreements. The politicians run over each other, and we think they're really about substantive ethical issues, but we don't even we can't even invoke the very principles that we're abiding by. The principles of ethics that McIntyre would say almost have to be presumed prior to engaging in a substantive discourse, which most contemporary Americans don't even, I guess, like fundamentally don't believe in. And I put this quote with Victor Hugo. I thought it best illuminated the failure of the modern account of ethics in the contemporary moral life about moral disagreements, because it's not that we just disagree about substantive claims. It's that the very principles McIntyre would say we disagree with, and also with respect to meta-ethics, which is a very important topic in philosophy and everything. But I guess at the end of the day, there's a whole rich tradition. But this distinction between realism, moral realism, and emotivism is one of the, I guess, most illuminating part of McIntyre's work. Because when I say one ought not to break promises, am I, as Hume would have said, projecting my preferences onto a reality that is intrinsically value-free? Or am I saying something transcendental about the external world? Which I guess, in other words, when one says, I guess, to their husband, when somebody says, you ought not lie to me, McIntyre would say, it's somewhat like a problem when we invoke the person's right to not the other person be lied to as just expressions of attitude and taste, because that's a problem. Because in that domain, I guess moral truth is not really about moral facts. It's just how apes like us learn to worry with words, and I think that's a very important thing, because this picture of morality that's in meta-ethics that's become really popular, that when we look at the world, all we see are patterns of events. This one event following another, and there's no corner of the universe that can announce one of these to be good or bad, apart from us. We're doing it. We're merely projecting our values onto a world that there's nothing there. It's just like this humor, it's impression, it's taste. When I say, I ought not lie, I ought not deceive someone, I'm invoking a principle that myself borrowed from my own mind and interaction with friends. There's nothing, there can't really possibly be something in the external world that would give me that right. And I guess McIntyre wants to say, in some sense, that's the problem. I guess that's on the nature of moral disagreements. And I don't want to reiterate the things on the worksheet. So I wanted this to be at first some insight on, and the ending. I thought it was interesting to end it with Kant, when it was for Kant, one can be both good and stupid, but for Aristotle, stupidity of a certain kind precludes goodness. But I guess the whole thing is about what does Kant and Rawls versus McIntyre and Aristotle, what do they mean by freedom? I think that's what it comes down to. Because for Kant, his account of freedom is that autonomy. I am only free when I act according to a law I give myself. And I am independent authors of my freedom. And the same thing with Rawls, that I guess Rawls would say justice is a virtue of social institutions insofar as we have agreed to on the principles of fairness behind some veil of inequality. Rawls would say in a just society, the liberties of equal citizenship are taken as settled, and the rights secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining. In the event we're not violate the right of some for others. Fairness is couched in first equality of rights, citizens, and fairness. This whole tradition presumes something about human nature and us that we're not bound by our tradition, our past, our memories. And I guess like that's kind of like unrealistic, McIntyre would say, because I can only answer the question of what I do in life. Okay, answer a prior question, namely what story or stories I find myself in. We all approach our circumstances in life as bearers of particular social identity. I belong to a certain community. Let's say I'm Iranian. I belong to a certain tribe. And what is good for me, McIntyre argues, has to be the good for someone who inhabits these roles. And we just can't even make sense of our moral experience without attending to these features about us. So I want to give some examples. In post-war France, a pilot was given a command to bomb a village, just like, as a way, it would happen in the event of war. And he said, I refuse to do it on the grounds that this village is a village I grew up in. And to bomb it would be a special moral crime, because even though for a cause bigger than myself, the pilot was saying that the cause of liberating France, I still resist to do it because I grew up in that town. I share my family, my memories with that tribe, so I won't do it. Here we can see that the individualist tradition break apart, because in all sorts of ways our identities are deeply embedded in social context. And when one reviews their life events and struggles, and you can see like it would be unfair to assume that we don't have some sort of obligations of solidarity and loyalty to our friends, our family, our loved ones, to our tradition, to community. So it could, in some sense, political obligations could potentially be a virtue, because it's an expression of